the Great Depression, which looms so large in American history and in American mythology, I think, is we hear a lot about it today. We heard a lot about it in the last few years with the Great Recession of 2009, 10, 11. That were we going back into another depression? I think people today, there are very few people, fewer and fewer people alive today who truly remember it, who truly lived it, who were affected by the Depression, so that it's becoming more and more part of mythology, more and more part of lore and legend and culture, really, than it ever was. I don't think a lot of people really understand. Most people alive today, as I said, are too young, and they don't really understand the depth of what a Great Depression is, what the causes of it were, what the outcome, what the effects of it were on unemployment, with 1 in 4 Americans out of work, and sometimes as high as 1 in 3. I mean, that's 25% unemployment, which is astounding today when we complain about 7, 8% unemployment. It had a kind of train wreck effect on American culture and American lives. And I don't think people appreciate it today. The Depression had begun in late 1929, years before Roosevelt was elected. I mean, Roosevelt was elected in 1932, so we had a worsening crisis from 1929, 30, 31, 32. Those were long years for people, and there was immediately, attempts to provide relief for people in some way under the Hoover administration and under, the various state governments around the country. It wasn't enough. It wasn't effective. So I think when the New Deal begins, in a kind of bureaucratic, administrative way, it also expands. It has to expand because just the scale of the monies have expanded. So yeah, all over the country they're taking over state relief projects and putting federal money into them. Well, it's generally conceded or generally believed, I think, that Minnesota felt the effects of the Depression less than other places. We were not affected, at least not in most of the state, by the Dust Bowl, for example. The famous images from the Great Plains and further south of the Dust Bowl of the 1933-34 era. We had a very strong, relatively strong urban economy in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We had still a fairly strong industrial base. Minnesota came out of the Depression more quickly as the Depression began to end, as World War II as production for the war began to ramp up in the late 1930s and the early 40s because of the iron mining. All that said, there was still a national impact of the Depression. It wasn't that Minnesota did not escape its effects by any means. It was still, it just wasn't it wasn't those kind of familiar images, the Dorothea Lange type, Walker Evans type images of poverty and depression that you see, that kind of govern what we think of when we close our eyes and think of the Depression. I don't think that was true in Minnesota. So Roosevelt is inaugurated in early 1933 and immediately signs into law the Civilian Conservation Corps Act, and that immediately puts millions of young men, all men, who are out of work, to work in reforestation efforts and building things in forested areas and in conservation of land throughout the country. Minnesota was a major center for employment of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So that's 1933 begins, 1934, and then all that CCC goes all the way into the 1940s. The WPA begins in 1935, and the Works Progress Administration, later known as the Works Project Administration. The WPA begins in 1935 nationally, and certainly begins to have its effect in Minnesota right away as well. I mean, among the most famous projects of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project. And the Federal Writers Project employed, it wasn't just to sort of give you money to go sit and write a novel. You were paid to write really useful things like guides, guidebooks. The Federal Writers Project produced the WPA guides of all 50 states, and there's one for Minnesota. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but writers were put to work doing research and writing of all sorts of things. And the same with artists. Artists were put to work, were paid to paint, but they were also paid to do research in the history of American design. That produced the National Design Index that's still in use in Washington. They produced famously just hundreds and hundreds of post office murals around the country. They produced murals, uplifting, inspiring murals for high schools and gymnasiums all over the country and in Minnesota. So yeah, artists and writers were put to work, as well as people who were working with their hands, masons and construction workers. The Depression was alleviated by, millions of tinier things, millions of people doing work on much smaller projects. If you drive over any bridge that was built in the 1930s, you're driving over a WPA project. So even the smallest little bridge, the smallest little playground, like the one up here on Snelling, up by Hamline University, these little playground buildings, those are WPA projects, employing probably a dozen people, not thousands of people. So it was in small things that I think it made the biggest difference. I think this all comes out of the idea of improving parks and for having improved recreational opportunities. Looking at our children, in the early 1930s, there was a sense of crisis. And Hoover, in fact, President Hoover calls a White House conference on America's children in 1930 or 32, I can't remember. There's this enormous sense of crisis about our kids not growing up in a healthy way, and that we need to sponsor more recreational opportunities for children. We need to get them off the streets. We need to get them organized. The membership in the Boy Scouts skyrockets and the Girl Scouts. Lots of healthier activities and clubs that were formed in the 1930s for kids. And that, I think, trickles up as well to the adult population, and people feel like there's a new emphasis on physical activity, on being outside, on parks and national parks, on hiking and swimming, on organized sports for kids in schools. All of these things begin to take off in the 1930s, and it's encouraged and in some ways enabled by the New Deal and its emphasis on the need to build a strong and healthy population. Part of the rhetoric behind the CCCs, for example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, wasn't just to get trees planted, but was to get these guys healthier. to get them off this urban streets and out into the woods where they would become manly men, and where life was healthier in the great outdoors. So that rhetoric informs a lot of these New Deal programs. I think there probably were naysayers about why are we employing artists to paint paintings? Why are we employing writers to do writing? I mean, aren't there more important things? They're building roads and bridges and schools and libraries. Why are we bothering with these recreational opportunities like golf courses and swimming pools? Well, I would imagine those naysayers didn't really get much of an audience. I mean, because people still wanted, people were thrilled to have these improvements in their civic infrastructure. To have a municipal golf course built, to have a swimming pool built in your community. Those were really important facilities for people. A way to get out and get some exercise. This was an era, when people were trying to promote the idea of healthier living, and I think that they were very much welcomed by people. Now, there was always naysayers, and on the Republican side, there was lots of opposition to Franklin Roosevelt's policies, and lots of criticism and cynicism about the WPA. Some opponents called it that it stood for "we poke along," or "we piddle along," or there was lots of criticism of shovel leaning. People, you'd hire 4 people to do the job of one person. That leaning on your shovel was considered to be one of the paid jobs of the WPA. So there was always naysayers and criticism, but I think for the most part there was huge public support. Roosevelt's reelected 4 times, so a great deal of support for his policies. There's a lot of nostalgia about the Great Depression too. I think a lot of it having to do with some of the images that I was talking about, the Dorothea Lange, the Walker Evans, the movies of the 1930s, the image of Franklin Roosevelt, who was such a strong and powerful leader, and such a great image, and such a great communicator. The impact of the radio. All of these things, the fireside chats, all of these things contribute to a kind of nostalgia about that period, the 1930s, and actually a great affection for that period of time. It's human nature to kind of remember the good times and forget the bad times, to remember the movies and the warm and fuzzy radio fireside chats, but to forget the bread lines and the starvation that people were experiencing, the incredible poverty, the incredible heat waves of the 1930s, and the Dust Bowl, and environmental degradation. These were bad times. They were hard times, as Studs Terkel called them, and in his famous oral history of the Great Depression. But I think it made people stronger. I mean, they came out of it feeling like they had survived, some of the worst times you could ever experience, and they felt stronger by it. Newspapers by the 1930s were already in decline. I mean, they began to suffer immediately. Well, not quite immediately, with the competition from radio. Radio, in its earliest days as a home entertainment medium, was just that. It was an entertainment medium. It wasn't a news and information medium. People still got their news in the early days of radio in the let's say the late 1920s and into about 1930. They still got their news from newspapers. But gradually, and especially with the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932, and that news story that goes from 32 to about 1936 with the execution of Bruno Hauptmann. Those years are the years of the greatest explosion in radio as a news medium. So at the height of the Depression, radio is the single most powerful organ of news transmission, far eclipsing the newspapers by that time. Of course, we didn't have television until the 1940s, but so it was really radio, and then the movies. Even at the worst years of the Depression, a lot of people told us when we interviewed them, we always could find a nickel for the movies on the weekend. People in the United States, the average American went to the movies like 4 times a week in the 1930s. It was, what you just did, for entertainment. Of course, there was no television to sit home in front of your TV and stay inside. You went out to the movies. Everybody went to the movies on Sundays. Whole families would go on Sundays. Kids would go on Saturdays. What else would you do on a Saturday? These people told us when we interviewed them. So movies were incredibly popular and powerful. Now, a lot of them were, kind of silly entertainment, and that's much has been written about that. That's entertainment, the 1930s, escapist entertainment, frothy comedies and musicals. But at the same time, there was a kind of lot of hard-hitting, socially relevant dramas that were happening in the 1930s too, that telling people how things were around the country. I mean, it drew America closer together. It made people, as did Roosevelt's radio fireside chats, it made America feel like one people. Had out of the 1920s, when we were still feeling, I think, increasingly as a sort of nation of nations, kind of atomized all around the country, the Depression and Roosevelt's leadership, I think, and Roosevelt's strategies of the way he talked about things really made people feel like this was a national event, which it was, of course, and a national project to get out of it. The national administrations like the WPA and the CCCs, all of those worked to unify the country, I think. People from all over the country had very similar experiences. And then, of course, that leads into World War II, and in some ways, it almost prepares the country for World War II. We have this decade-long experience of dealing with hardship in the Great Depression and working together, throwing our shoulders behind this massive project. 1941 comes along, and Pearl Harbor, and we throw ourselves into yet another major project, a project to make the world safe for democracy. I think people, including me, still don't or would not be able to articulate for you. You'd have to talk to an economic historian, somebody to articulate for you in the kind of technical economic terms what that term means, the Great Depression. What actually happens to money, and why is unemployment? What is a stock market crash? All of those things, those are, of course, those are critical kind of definitional aspects of this that I'm not really able to talk about. But I know what the cultural impacts of the Depression are, and they are profound. They're life-changing. And I think that's why we look back on it, the Depression, as this period of great unemployment, as we fear today happening in this period of great. It wasn't just a recession; it was a depression. It was worse than a recession. Enormous fortunes were lost. People lost their entire life savings and then some. People went absolutely flat broke. What does that mean? How does that affect somebody? How does that affect a culture? So I'm always just really impressed with the resilience of people and their abilities to survive these things and their strategies to using to survive these enormous effects. The New Deal changed lives. I think, I did a lot of work a few years ago with the so-called Greatest Generation, interviewing lots and lots of men and women for this major project at the Historical Society called Minnesota's Greatest Generation, and I, talked really to hundreds of them, and the assumption being that the Greatest Generation was the generation shaped by World War II. And that's, the kind of core, the crux of their lives. But when I talked to them, more and more of them would say, the war had an enormous impact on me, but I think the greatest impact on my generation was the Great Depression. That shaped our lives, that shaped our outlook on things. That affected my own parents, they would tell me. These men and women in their 80s and 90s remembering very, very movingly and emotionally, remembering the sacrifices that their own parents had to do to get their families through the Depression, to put food on the table, to learn how to reuse things, use it up, wear it out. That had an enormous impact on a whole generation of people. Almost more, they would say, almost more than World War II itself.